Greetings, my friends. It's really, it's a joy to see your faces, and I'm really grateful that Kabir has brought us together to be in conversation today, and specifically, right, to learn more about what he's up to with this initiative called MettaCare. And, you know, right before we got on the call, I was reflecting on a good place to start, and which led me into reflecting on when Kabir and I started, meaning our origin story. And I thought I would just, very briefly to give that context, because it actually weaves all of us together, and kind of start the high level inquiry from there. And then I'd invite this really to be a group conversation. And I think that the intention is to really get clear on who is Kabir, what is this initiative he has birthed and birthing into the world called MettaCare, and why we all feel that it's very crucial and important. And so I hadn't thought about this, but we met, Elisa, you can help me, about 14 years ago.
October 2006.
Wow, that just gave me the chills. Right, so we met as a learning community where Elisa also, you two journeyed from Southern California to Washington State, where we engaged in an 18-month learning cohort journey. And I think because of the context, and at that point you'd been a quadriplegic for 4 years. 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'll say very truthfully, because of who you are and the context of our meeting, the impression, and I think this is true for so many people when they walk away from meeting you, isn't Kabir, the disabled person, but it's the impression that one walks away with is your brilliant, engaged, sponge-like mind, your sense-making mind, and your giant heart. And I'm not sure when it was exactly, maybe a year or so into our learning together and the program, about a year maybe after we met, that I actually came down to San Diego to your house for the first time. And that was when it was a massive eye-opening for me in terms of realizing what it takes for you as a quadriplegic, quite frankly, just to stay alive. Your daily regimen. And this, of course, loops Tomas in, because that's where we met, as he was one of your caregivers at that time. And that was really, really profoundly humbling for me, right? Because I think as an able-bodied person, it's so easy for us to take for granted, right? That we can wake up and get out of bed in the morning on our own. And what struck me both in your visits coming up to Washington State, because you always brought your caregiver, of course, necessarily with you, but also when I came down there, and the journey of getting to know you so impressed me, also because of your intentionality around the care that you demanded to be around you. Meaning you weren't just going through a state-driven agency route, but you were very deliberate around wanting to build a community of care. And I think that's a testament that Tomas, who is no longer, under your employment, but is now a dear friend. And this is not a rarity. But that also, to me, just was very incredibly striking, your intention to not just have this be a transactional process environment, but a real reciprocal, mutual fabric that you were weaving. And I think that's probably a good segue into then at some point this movement, initiative, entity called MettaCare sprouted, which I've been tracking, to a little, small degree. So I'd love to hear from you, Kabir, kind of the long journey of what birthed MettaCare. And then I think from there will be many detailed questions we can get into.
Thank you for that really loving remembrance of Zikr, taking us through there. And I was struck by the grace of this conversation that I have you, who met me as a quadriplegic and a dear friend, and our friendship over those years, and how Tomas also met in friendship but came to be a caregiver and then moved back into his work outside of that, and our friendship stayed so strong. And Elisa, who's been a friend for so long, even before my injury, and such incredible friends of mine here together today. It's just, Tomas sent me an article the other day about the sense of worthlessness. And that would be a very hard feeling for me to come by right now, facing the three of you. And so, yeah, from the history of my life, growing up in Montana and Washington State, this aspect of community has just been a part of the soup I've been stewed in. And so that was naturally a disposition that I brought into the condition of injury. And so I wove those relationships of community with the people who came around me, naturally, whether they were the other paraplegics and quadriplegics doing the recovery work that I was doing, whether they were the healers, whether they were the facilitators of recovery efforts, whether they were the caregivers of myself or others, or the family. That kind of heartbeat throb of community was always just an implicit taste of the water. But it really came to pass when Elisa, one day when I needed care, asked our friend David, whom I had yet to meet, but maybe once, if he would come and care for me. And David, having been a caregiver for his mother years in past, and also then for Elisa's father. And David's disposition to really contemplate deeply on what he's present to and what is being experienced by him, through him, and by those around him. And David came and basically introduced himself to my care and my life and brought his gregarious generosity to that, and then left for a year, after about a year of working together and starting to really feel into the space that I was living. And then about a year later, I think it was maybe 2, he came back to the States, and I had a granny flat at the time, and I had the good fortune that he needed a place to stay and moved in. And he became a part of our family. I was raising my daughter at the time, and he stepped joyfully into the role of uncle, but also with his keen mind kind of circling the process of care and the dynamic of my household. And that provided for me a dialogic partner around this the field of care and what were the dynamics coming and going and how were those being shaped, because he was there generally 24/7 with a present awareness to who was coming and going, how those relationships were unfolding and what tensions were emerging. And so that provided, I think, for both of us, a sounding board for one another to bring our unique kind of dharmas of inquiry, mine always kind of scanning, looking, probing, asking. David's more the mirror of that, the reflective pool that just drinks in and allows to shape. And that was a really synergistic friendship. And it lasted and continued, obviously, to this day. But he came back, I think, in 2012. And in 2015, as I was attempting to start a business and had an executive assistant and her girlfriend and a business partner and her contacts and caregivers and this kind of dynamic inquiry into how can we leverage this community into the world, that we actually sat down as a group and started writing on the flip charts, diagramming. I think that was the first time that we actually took out a fictitious business name and filed some paperwork on a legal entity, and started to really put on the chalkboard, like what's possible here, what's happening here, why is this work, why is this of value, why is Kabir's incidences of infection or hospitalization, why are those dropping off precipitously? Is it in fact true that the people that come through and participate here leave to something far more powerful and interesting than they came in with? And so that was really the journey to inception. And while in 2015 it didn't ultimately cohere into a project beyond my reach, it stayed in the DNA of what we were doing together, and David with me. And David's undying inquiry into the subject and constructs of care, such that when a year, a little more ago, when he moved back to be with his father on the East Coast and participate in his care, that it has actually stretched the conversation in a really unique and beautiful way, where we now feel a part of one another's acute care fields and participate in this ongoing inquiry of what is care, what when it fails, what when it meets resistance, what when it's flourishing, and how do we take all of that in and drink it as wisdom to be collected forward for a world that now is bursting at the seams for better care. Does that feel like a good response to?
Wonderful. Yeah. And it begs the question now of how would you define what MettaCare is? What is it? You've started a crowdfunding campaign, so obviously you're raising money, and we can get more into that. But top level, like what is MettaCare? What is its unique value proposition or offer, if you will, that sets it apart from anything that's happening out there in the healthcare field?
Well, when we look at kind of old industrial models of anything, what we see is a transactional model. An employee comes to work, they move forward some profitable endeavor defined by some certain set of shareholder values. They are repaid for their efforts in some way, and if the endeavor works, it works, and everybody gets a little something out of it. More recently, we see models of care and organization of any kind where there's a greater sense of camaraderie, a greater sense of shared ownership in an endeavor. And that kind of collaboration works a little bit exponentially better and produces a little bit finer result. But what I think we still have opportunity to delve into is the richness that each human being is from their history and their upbringing and the upbringing of their parents before them, that there's this movement of context that surrounds a body like a substance that gets on us and stays with us and grows and evolves with us, such that, and the importance of this is that there's no moment in our life where a human being isn't exchanging value with their environment. It may be invisible, it may be unrecognized, but there's always a learning. We're always catalytic, affecting the state of the room, the state of the endeavor, the inspiration of someone else. And we're always being affected by our this moment's experience. And in that sense, we kind of transcend and leave behind the idea of the transactional, linear process where you can identify two endpoints, the client and the service provider. And that linear process becomes omnidirectional, which is a term that David coined in terms of omnidirectional care awareness, that relationship to evolving growth and well-being is omnidirectional and omnipresent. And so MettaCare is a study of honoring that and intentionally nurturing and supporting that, the way a human resources department might, see if you can get better training to do your job, or, if you're a copywriter, can we give you some more classes on copywriting that will help you be more effective? MettaCare expands that to really a listening in all directions, like so that we each other can also be sounding boards and HR departments for one another and resources to one another to nourish what's emerging. And it's not ultimately about building a better caregiver in the traditional home health sense, as it's building the capacity to care in all of the individuals and in the way that they are together, such that when they decide to leave to be a barista or a clinical psychologist or an Ayurvedic health practitioner or an entrepreneur, that they leave with a new, deeper capacity to skillfully care for all of those momentary interactions that they're continuing to encounter and that will enrich and inform what they do in the world.
So it sounds like it's really attending to what you might call like this hidden dimension of well-being, where we've lost this appreciation of the relational quality, the importance, like that is actually factors into our health, right? That it's not just the material piece, it's not just your blood count and bone density. Yeah. So yeah, where is the project? I know that I think there are a few questions around, I know you've been working with a lot of folks in the San Diego area. You've been in these conversations, like deep in these conversations with various practitioners and experts, if you will, in the healthcare in that region. Where is MettaCare as an entity, and like what's your vision?
Where to grab the thread on that? It's important for an initiative to start simple. A friend of mine that I follow, his blog, titled the blog the other day, Crawl, Walk, Run, about starting a business or an initiative. And the crawling for Medicare is really about making the space for the conversation, for the dialogue to become more explicit. Right now, David and I have a fairly consistent, explicit dialogue about what emerges for us in MettaCare. And that dialogue is present, but a little more implicit in the relationships to my immediate caregivers, who generally are here right now for a care shift with activities of household maintenance and my health and food and these sorts of things to occupy the mind, so that there's not a lot of kind of boardroom discussion about the nuance of MettaCare, although that does come up, you know, during range of motion or over lunch. But the process right now is at a place where we need to create the structure for not only those people directly involved here in this prototypical example of MettaCare, but also partners in the San Diego bioregion, and even some beyond those walls, to participate in shaping a dialogue around care. And I think present in the crawl, but also the run, is this idea that care in a community, care in a bioregion, care in a family, care in a home, care in an individual, is it's a resource, like water is a resource. And so in a bioregion, there have been numerous examples of a wider community caretaking the commons of water. And the opportunity, and also then built into the DNA of what we do and how we begin to move this out of the conceptual, practical prototype into the world, is to shape that wider community sharing of care as a resource in the commons that flows through hospitals and doctors' offices and home environments and business incubators and city politics, and but really leveraging the community focused on the term care in healthcare is where we start. We really start to organize that community to be in dialogue and to share insight and information and wisdom, and to make new knowledge together about how care flows and functions and creates well-being at the individual, at the small systems, and at the bioregional level.
And so I mean, I have more questions there, but I want to get into just the crowdfunding aspect of it also. I know you've started a campaign. What are the funds specifically for? What will they enable? What will they, yeah.
Yeah. So we started the crowdfunding campaign, it may have been March, and we're really successful with a small outreach. We raised $40,000. And this meets an intersection of something personal and something, I think, not to put too much a shine on it, but I think something valuable, which is that I've been living and investing in what has become MettaCare on settlement funds from my injury for 17 years, 18 years ago. And those funds have run nearly out. And in order to...
Can I, wait, I want to, yeah, I don't like to interrupt normally, but I want to point out that those funds have run out because you have outlived your projected lifespan from the...
Not entirely true.
Okay.
There's actuary tables, and I think they put me at 70. I'm 48 now.
Okay.
But there's systemic structure in place that is inherently uncaring.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll try to keep this brief, but when an individual is injured by a product liability issue, the product liability issue almost always comes up because of social economics, that in order to build a $50,000 vehicle, I've got to end my testing and design phase after 2 years. If I want to make the vehicle really safe, I've got to design it for 4 years. But the market math doesn't work out after 2. And so I'm going to release the vehicle in the wild after 2 years of engineering. It's going to injure and kill a handful of people. And we're going to set aside, as a company doing business in the modern world, a slush fund of $50 million that is going to cover our liability expenses for the coming year. And we're going to settle with those people. We're going to pay funeral expenses, and we're going to pay caregiving expenses, and we're going to pay what have you. But again, there's another layer, and I don't blame people. That's the natural condition, because nobody's paying $100,000 for a $40,000 car. It's not the world we've made together. But at the same time, the attorneys working with the plaintiff, in my case, are investing an enormous amount of time and energy, years, in the case, where if they fail to draw a reward for me, they get nothing for their time. And worse, they watch the person they just spent 2 years getting to know the intimate needs of go into a very desolate and difficult place with nothing. So my own advocates are incentivized to get me to settle for something. Even if I have a really good case and I take it to court and we win, it will be appealed. And they will work towards 5 years or more without guarantee of pay, continuing to become invested in this person in order to see some hopeful outcome. So even one's own attorneys and the defense attorneys, who are quite skilled and do this every day of the year for a living, are incentivized to say, take the money that's on the table. And the way that this works, in the way that is at all functional and conscionable by the participants, is that the money then goes into a special trust, in a sense, apart from ownership of the plaintiff or injured party. And that distance allows the injured party to claim social assistance, and so get on Medi-Cal or Medicaid. And that steps in and pays a fair share of their medical costs going forward. It's money that comes out of the public coffers. It's the way that we, the public, finance the unfortunate shortage of design time for the vehicle or the toaster or the product, whatever it might be. And because of my puritanical disposition, that was unconscionable to me. And what was more important to me was to settle the funds that were eventually available into my own account, and to take on a sense of responsibility to make something of those funds, to do something creative with those funds. And I made, yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's a much more nuanced, both sobering and nuanced understanding, description, and for my own understanding, it's quite profound. And to reflect, that you chose, to not go that route because of your staunch stance. But little did we know, and by way of the mystery of the way the world works, that you were investing in this not foreseen, emergent initiative now called MettaCare. So tie us back into then where
so wind turbines didn't work out. Lake Havasu real estate didn't work out. Starting my own consulting practice didn't work out. Venture investing didn't work out. There was a lot of things that I learned in each of those events. I spent too much money on attorneys teaching me what I was doing wrong in business, but thankful to those attorneys for their education. And I also, as you suggest, like implicitly made this really profound investment in the field of care. And it, as I suggested earlier, became more and more apparent as time went by. And in the last waves of my being resourced for finance, I started to really learn a lot about finance and economics. And it was too late to turn the graph around on my, not slight medical expense each month. But it contributed to looking at life through an economic lens. Like what do I have available? What are my needs? What does the community need? Where is there a synergy between those resources, my own capacities, and what is needed? And so coming to a place of emerging crisis in my own resourcefulness, I was steered quite directly to the one of 3 or 4 initiatives that I had at the front of my heart to develop something generative for myself and for the world. And I had a lot of good connections and good support that had been in dialogue more up close about the caregiving process here and the MettaCare idea. As you suggested, skilled and mature individuals. And that became a conversation of how to shape a clear and definable project that could move quickly what's been happening implicitly here into the world in a way that becomes accessible and useful to others. And little did we know that that effort to clarify and make that explanation would meet this pandemic and the kind of ballooned awareness of the absence and needs for care. And within it, me suffering a microcosm of the world's scarcity and seeing what that scarcity does to my own health, which tragically has been insulated, well, fortunately has been insulated tragically from too many others that don't have that resource or that disposition to formulate a community of well-being that struggle with my condition and worse every day. But then also to see the impacts on my health, but on the health of the community, how that strains the caregivers who participate, who are, as I suggested, every moment giving and receiving into that context. And then to see what happens when the resources run thin, when caregivers fall away and there's a dearth of actual care, and we bring in the institutions and the services providers that show up at your door to offer care right now today with some level of skill, and the cost of that and the inefficiencies in that and the challenges in that and the pressures that those people face in their lives. So I've like rather fortunately fallen into very dire straits that illuminate for me in much greater nuance the profound importance of what's possible by bringing MettaCare forward and nurturing that dialogue and that practice in a wider community. Not just with the pandemic, but with the emerging need for home care as the baby boomers age. And so there's so much providence and grace at play that, that's the fundraising, the first $40,000 that we raised really paid for me to stay in my home with care and to learn the hard lessons in greater depth of how is a care system strained
Mhm.
when the lower levels of Maslow's pyramid, the fundamental survival needs are threatened.
Yeah, so I want to just make that clear for people who may be listening later, that uh, yeah, that you have the direct recent anecdotal evidence of the distinction between receiving care and the Medicare framework. Um, so to break down what you just said, because your resources are running down, you've had to go through more of the state-driven, like agency care, and have been able, you've directly witnessed the difference.
Yeah, directly.
Not judging the people.
No,
It's
how right those systems are for Medicare. How
yes.
important, how badly the care service provider systems. I had a fellow show up here today. You know, he came out of his home. He made the trip here because of internal dysfunction of the care system there. I had radioed them 2 days ago to say I didn't need that care today because thankfully a beloved friend has stepped in and has been here with me today. And yeah, I've seen in a more nuanced and less theoretical way how immediately this is applicable.
Right, both at the systems level, inefficiency of systems, and then at the relational level.
Yeah.
I want to invite Elisa, Tomas, you all to jump in with any questions. I know that we have a list of questions that have come in also that I want to make sure we address, but I want to, please don't be shy to.
Well, actually, I would like to ask Kabir to press in to what this line of question is, because I think that the Medicare process has gone already some beyond the theoretical. I say that because I see this extension of the classical health system, the spectrum of it, as very limited and commodified, and kind of set up in such a way that care is considered down to the hours served and the needed aspects, and as you mentioned, Katie, the relational is not even thought about. When I say it's gone beyond just the theoretical or just the experiential for Kabir, I thought maybe you could speak a little bit, Kabir, to the documentation that you have developed, the system of documentation you've developed to have a clear handoff from caregiver to caregiver, as one question. And then another question in that would be how you've incorporated into your thinking the well-being of the caregivers themselves, the multi-directional aspect.
So one of the things that really got lit on fire in 2015 was the idea and value of having an app that would allow not just an internal care system like my own with 5 caregivers, but a whole neighborhood and more to find the shared resources of care and connect and create better efficiencies and better access to information and better care as determined by the endpoints. And out of that came the use of a software package, a Trello software, which is a kind of a team collaboration type software that we use. And David's done a really nice job of prototyping a structure for that, for a weekly kind of review board where each member of the care team, actually excluding myself for the main boards, reports things like, you know, Kabir's hydration, Kabir's dietary intake, his bowel movements, but also the conversation we had while he was getting up, or how I found the space and wondered, you know, was so-and-so feeling while they left this undone or that, or how I'm feeling, or the altercation that occurred between me and Kabir, or how the schedule is not working for me, or this frustration that I'm bringing with me from home that's real and a part of my life and part of my lived experience today. And it's created a transparency, a community transparency that includes also my doctor, who I'm very fortunate has been enthusiastic to participate with this and to, you know, allow himself and his practice to be affected and moved by MettaCare and what we are collaboratively creating together, not outside of him, but with him as a living, breathing, actual full partner of this experiment. And so, and others, you know, others, Elisa may be looped into the Trello board so that immediate family, friends, community, not too far out because it's a very sacred kind of private space, but also those who are in a sense initiated can share in that collective story. And it really is about sharing story, because that is where we draw individually wisdom, and that starts to touch into a little bit caring for the caregivers, that they get to see themselves reflected, their work reflected, and others reflected in a very explicit and specific place. But also that the dynamic of relationship in the MettaCare processes it's living here has to do with that kind of ongoing inquiry of what's alive for you today, what's persisting for you today, how can we honor one another, not in a transactional sense, but in a full embodied sense. Like, what did you bring in today? Did you see something yesterday that has moved you to change some course of your life today? And how can we honor and understand that about you, so that this place that you come is a place of nourishment and care for what's moving in you, because that's what it is explicitly for me as a quadriplegic who, as Katie suggests, doesn't get out of bed in the morning without others. Well, what's the point of getting out of bed? What am I going to do? Why? And what of that can I share with caregivers that inspires and encourages them to want me to be well, and want me to be up early, and want me to be well fed, and want me to be available to connect and meet with others. And so it really is about creating a, you know, our friend Dr. Ari says, awakening an individual to awaken a community.
I'd
And
love
so
to
awaken the world.
hear from Tomas, being on the experiential end of, granted, it was pre-Medicare, but it certainly was, I would say it was in formation, quietly, invisibly in formation. Yeah, I'd be curious if you could speak to just the impact of being a caregiver in that environment.
Yeah, I guess I would have begun caregiving for you, Kabir, in about 2005 or so. Yeah. You know, I had worked in, you know, providing care to others before then, but that was the first time that I was able to interact in a way that felt more holistic in a lot of ways. Up until then, it was very, very much one direction, you know, just like there are orders, here's what you're supposed to do, you carry out these orders, you provide care in this way, and as long as there are no mishaps, accidents, injuries, you know, the job is done and everyone's happy. And there wasn't really ever any kind of a feedback loop of like, how are people feeling along that chain? Who's feeling satisfied or dissatisfied, and why? What can be done differently? That wasn't really part of the experience. And then when in working with Kabir, there was automatically a very rich dialogue. Like with Kabir, it was just the nature of the way things were in that environment. We had a lot of time together to get to know each other, to really dive deep into like what what did everyone want beyond this situation of care? You know, were there like long-term dreams and goals that we were all part of? Like having a sense of what the big picture is huge in terms of feeling inspired and enthusiastic about being part of something. And I always felt that in working with Kabir, you know, that I knew that it wasn't just, you know, put that over here and put this over there. And, you know, there was always a much bigger plan that, you know, today we're going to do this. We're going to hop in the van. We're going to go here. We're going to meet these people, you know, and the reason we're meeting these people is because they're involved in this project. And, you know, it's just, so I feel like I have a really powerful, personally powerful appreciation of what it means to be involved in a more integrated way with the whole system. And you talked about, there were two terms that were used earlier, the systems perspective and relational perspective. And I mean, those are just naturally part of the whole process of working with. I feel like I could go on and explain. Since then, I've had the opportunity to work in healthcare, you know, in hospital settings, you know, on a general floor, surgical floor, intensive care units, and watched how those dynamics play out. And then from there went to home health and eventually to hospice. And now I'm doing my own thing where I work with people one-on-one individually. And so all throughout that, especially in the corporate hospital, home health, even hospice settings, there were attempts by those systems to try to bring some of this bigger perspective into play, but because of the way the rules are dictated by insurance and so much fear around malpractice and lawsuits and time is money and all of these things, and Medicare, MEDI care regulations and being reimbursed by insurance, you know, all these things get in the way, and all of the talk about making things human and personal and wanting to go in that direction of importance of the relational side of things. It becomes it's just kind of, it's a plan, it's talked about, but there's not really any way to implement it. And so a lot of times people, it's not uncommon to find people at all levels in these systems, you know, just exhausted, jaded, dealing with their own unaddressed, unhealed physical injuries and mental, emotional stresses and traumas around whatever fears coming up in those environments, and everyone being pushed to get as much done as possible in as little time as possible. So I guess with all of that said, you know, kind of coming back around to working with Kabir and now being aware of this MettaCare vision. I feel a lot of excitement, and I see a lot of promise, and maybe it's because I've spent so much time in these other systems now. I'm wondering how that can get in, how this vision can be implemented without running into those same kinds of issues. As it seems like when you get enough people involved and a project gets big enough, that in and of itself becomes its own challenge. And so I'm not sure where to go from there.
I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I would love to hear you respond to that, Kabir.
Well, there's a couple of things that make this a window of opportunity. One is that the context of care in America is precipitously on the threshold of a dramatic change. You simply cannot build enough facilities fast enough for the people that are going to need care tomorrow. This is coming from a developer that spends hundreds of millions of dollars developing care facilities. You can't build them fast enough. I'd love to. It's not possible. Care is moving from the institution to the home. COVID has reinforced that. And so we have a new care context to invent. And there's a lot of leverage in that. The other piece is the threshold of strain, where it'll keep hurting until it hurts badly enough. And we might almost be hurting badly enough that we can push on some of those things that last year seemed immovable. And then we might find some greater pliability. Then the two other things that I would mention is it becomes a dialogue of care, not just within an institution, but a care that lives in the people inside the institutions and the contexts, and the way that that care scales as an expression of that institution in relationship to the other institutions. Again, this goes back to how where we stand to view care. Care isn't something you do for me on command. Care is a collective resource that's present right now among all of us. And how are we going to steward care in our community so that it flows not just into the people that are broken in the spine or aged in the body, but the people whose hearts are broken in the institution because they've been trying to give their love and care to others and find themselves up again against red ink and tape. And so there's an empowerment way of structuring the dialogue that's local to the individuals in the institutions and transcendent of the institutional boundaries itself. And then the final thing that I would speak to is that you brought up government policy and insurance. And care, like water, doesn't stop because you put up a sign that says the hospital ends here. And so MettaCare, treating care as a commons resource, is also about how does it find its way into those halls of regulation, those halls of power, those halls of insurance. And the thing I would just hold up as an example is an institution in the Netherlands called Buurtzorg that does home health nursing. It's a very specific, skilled home health nursing, where in America, the nurse comes in, she's here for a few minutes, she's got 3 minutes to administer a shot, 2 more to administer a pill, 5 minutes to take your pulse and get out. Buurtzorg is reorganized, and it's a much more dialogic relational process. And the caregivers have a much greater say and stake in how the system operates. And it grew in a matter of years to overtake 80%, and possibly more by now, of the Netherlands healthcare in this context. And so treating care not as a medical procedure, yes, that, and how I am empowered by the care I'm receiving to be a more full participant in the world that we're co-shaping, that creates a much greater, in institution right now, we have so often the metaphor of, I really would like things to change, and I've told my boss that. And the message gets a little weaker as it continues up the chain into more complex negotiation. And it doesn't ever actually penetrate anything. But when we create systems of care that are economic, meaning that they're not just financial in base, but they're also relational in base, they're also natural, environmental in base, that they're also cultural in base, they're also in the awareness that's brought out of an individual into the world, into the practice. This creates a much more robust approach to seeing care flow where it must, which is into those regulations, into those traditional structures, relationally, into the way we shape our processes.
I think this is a good segue into, I mean, where I want to hear you speak to, Kabir, is the partnerships that you've developed, because that has been relational. And to the point that you're making, like the systems change by way of also the brokenhearted caregivers, you know, who have been up against probably in their own, feeling divided in their own being. I think both to your point, Tomas, it's like, how do these things ever change? So I think you've probably hit on a pulse of longing in some of your healthcare professionals. So I know you've developed some partnerships, and if you want to, if it feels worthwhile to speak to those, and what, yeah, by way of storytelling, I guess, you know, what have you seen that's encouraging, inspiring?
It starts really small. I'm always surprised when the agency people are coming, and I've spent the last few hours getting to know this person, developing a relationship with them, and another person comes from the same place that they work, and they've never met, or they've never been introduced. Right? That I step in and I introduce TJ, meet Susan, Susan, meet TJ. And ordinarily they seem to be used to just kind of like, well, see you later. Because, you know, our, like you said, Tomas, our clock out time and your clock out time and my clock in time is by regulation to happen on the porch and is at the same time. And so one of the things that I see here is when I can bring the care team, the partners together in dialogue, in physical presence, or more recently in Zoom collective spaces for an hour or for 3 or 4 hours to share lunch and to bring up what's working and what's not working and how's it going in your life and who's your kids and what not. That creates a greater strength in that community. And I've experienced that in partnership with my doctor, who has longed for years and, you know, recently brought many of his patients together to commune collectively, talk about what's working, talk about what's not working, why do we like working with Dr. Mike, on and on. And that itself has ballooned into a kind of a multi-headed healthcare and patient initiative, patient empowerment initiative that exists today. And I was privileged to be a part of the founding and the shaping of, and am very much in relationship as a part of that community and in dialogue with the leaders and the directors of that community, and participating in the conversation of how does MettaCare, how does the lens that I bring through here inform and impact those efforts and those initiatives. And out of that kind of expansive movement of my doctor, he's connected to a large scale institutional health initiative. He also works for one of the universities here as well, that is looking for greater, more skillful ways to deliver and to do care. And so one of the visions that he's shared, that we share there, is to put in that institution a center for the design of care that is acting as a resource and a clearinghouse and a steward of the San Diego bioregional field of caring for the commons of care in very practical ways, where we educate families, we educate caregivers, we educate practitioners, we educate executives, we educate anybody that's interested in understanding more about how care flows in this increasingly care needed environment. And beyond that, I have relationships, some of which you know, Katie, with people who've been at the global scale involved with like national care initiatives and healthcare systems design and development and nurturance, and dealing with how do we approach not just making this hospital more efficient, but how do we approach adverse childhood experiences as a construct of wellness in society, and how do we begin to address that? So I have really tremendous resource in the dialogic partners and the mentors that take an interest in me and in this work, and have participated with, as Elisa suggested, in generating some of that mostly still informal documentation of what is possible here, what is possible to invent. And by no means do I claim or think that David and I have the market cornered on what MettaCare is or ought to be, but that there's tremendous input from others who collaborate in active and passive ways to shape and inform. And that's to me, that's the threshold of excitement, because when we, and I never finished kind of the crowdfunding question, why raise more money now if what I just raised basically kept me afloat to stare deeper into the maw of poverty? The reason now to fundraise the next $60,000 is because, by the grace of God, maybe that funds the next 4 months of my care, which is then enough time to corral all of those dialogic things into a project proposal description that says, somebody step forward and put $250,000 or $500,000 into this. Let's actually do something in the bioregion, in the community, over the next year that demonstrates the viability of moving this out of one home into other homes and into other institutional contexts, and into, again, the collective dialogue. And when I get back to the excitement, there are initiatives and people running institutions that I know that are interested and want to have this conversation, and to facilitate and to bring this conversation to be. There are people with such tremendous value already working on this challenge of care in the world, but to start to more effectively network that dialogue into a global song.
Yeah, it feels like a very ripe peach, like like ready to fall off the branch. So I know you've titled the campaign the MettaCare Bridge. What's the bridge aspect?
The bridge is simply because what we're funding is the ability to have care partners and practitioners here looking, thinking, writing, creating this proposal, bridging it from here to a place where there's a proposal that we can take to San Diego community foundations and other institutions that have resources to invest in bettering the health and well-being of this community, to actually fund something with salaries. Right now we're shoestring budgeting things, but actually pay people to show up, not just to get me out of bed, but to show up 2 more days a week to actually construct and relate and build out this. Right now, some of my best caregivers are at other jobs, right? For great benefit to all of us, for the experience, for the exposure, for their work, for their economic stability, but to do something more grounded in terms of delivering what I sincerely hope has been a worthwhile formation.
Yeah, I think at least we can say the 3 of us would agree with that. I'm thinking, responding partly, Tomas, to your question and frustration, if I can stretch it to that, bumping up against the current paradigm. I know that Tyler had written in the question about the business case for, and in a way, this is an inroad even to, I would say, the current model. I mean, Kabir, can you speak to what you would see as, business advantages of moving with the Medicare model?
Yeah, if we look at, for example, in 2015, one of the things that we did was we gave a raise to everybody in the care system. And we gave each person the authority to write their own salary, so that those people could write a salary that allowed them to relax about their bills, to relax, to not feel like they needed every minute of a shift, to worry about making sure they were putting ends together, but to just relax and show up and contribute their fullest heart self with their world on their back somehow not so heavy. And just a momentary footnote there, what happened immediately was the level of my care plummeted. And what we learned was just how starved people are. So many people, and particularly in the home caring professions, for the room for themselves. Right, such that when you gave them a drink of water, they guzzled. But what also happened then was that we were able as a community to see that, to correct that, to return, and to bring additional energy into the process that built more. I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of the question. It has to do with economic viability.
Yeah, well, and Tomas was wondering, how does this not just run up against business as usual? And from a business perspective, right? I'm imagining, like I know that you've had trouble retaining caregivers. I think you've also had caregivers who have stayed with you for years and years, right? So turnover, efficiencies within the system because of heightened coordination, et cetera.
If we just do the math on, I gave everybody a raise on Thursday, and I was hospitalized 3 fewer times this year. I didn't pay them enough. The expense was up maybe $50,000 in a year, but the cost was down 150 or more. And I spent less time in incubation, ICU for a UTI or a pneumonia, and more time creatively engaged with community. So never mind the non-monetary wealth being built in those spaces. And then the other thing is that there's some very practical monetizable aspects of Medicare. It creates a consulting practice that can reach around the globe easily. It creates an app that is tremendously useful and useful on the smartphone of nearly everybody on the planet. There's many ways in which the economic viability is present. It starts out in dialogue, though. It starts out crawl.
So in time, do you foresee, is there a Medicare toolkit? There's an app, is there a tool, what are the artifacts?
There's training modules, there's resources for families to get online. You're injured, your loved one is just injured. I went through that. Your loved one is just injured, and by the way, we know almost nothing. Here's 10 minutes of introduction to this immobile quadriplegic. Do this, do that, do this, see you later. There's so much opportunity to create artifacts of education, but also systems for ongoing sharing of education and wisdom and resource and intelligence. The products that we use to treat skin breakdown, which on me used to be very, 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 very common, we developed here out of the shared intelligence and resource of this dynamic community. And those products work incredibly well. And today I, fortunately, knock on wood, suffer dramatically fewer incidences of needing even to use them.
Beautiful. Elisa, Tomas, any more curiosities?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the, Kabir, you just mentioned training modules and resources for families. It seems like it implies, you know, some kind of online, at least in some way, some kind of online connection and support, some way for people to build community, you know, on the one hand, using these resources to inform themselves, and then use the new information to provide better care for their loved ones, those people in their care, for themselves. But like even beyond that, these smaller communities, I'm imagining, would be connecting to each other. So support networks all over the place, groups and families who are able to be in contact with each other and learn from each other and support each other. And that's exciting to me, because that's it feels to me like that's where things become real, when there's somebody just like me who's struggling with the same stuff and they're having some kind of success, or we're able to be there for each other. That's exciting to me. And beyond that, because we're talking about moving this into the bigger systems that are already in place, finding ways to appeal to healthcare providers and caregivers in more, I don't know, professional settings, because I know they're also really starving for some kind of support. You know, I saw it all the time. You know, people wanting there to be something bigger that they're a part of, and wanting support, and the system not really being able to provide that. So I guess more than anything, I'm excited about what kinds of possibilities that would create, and how that would come into play, and already imagining, got some ideas.
Right, and speaking back to Katie's question about resources, one of the people in our immediate sphere is a highly skilled and very mature learning course designer who has facilitated for many, many years online learning processes, and has, in his late 60s, maybe even early 70s, found a renewed and excited passion for creating online learning content, and is really excited when we can do it to move forward in creating that content with us here. So we really have an exquisite storm of the right partners, you know, well-connected medical professionals, incredibly seasoned and skilled business practitioners, healthcare systems designers, I mean, caregivers who've been caregiving for years, the three of you, you know, and on and on and on. And so,
In the right time.
yeah.
Matched with the right time, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm amazed about that. Like, there really is, I mean, the world is just calling for some kind of support in this way. You know, when I was working in hospice, you know, it occurred to me that, you know, this is all potentially, in some way, looking at this, we're all in hospice, right? Like, this is all palliative care in some way or other. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me really important to help people understand that caregiving healthcare, illness, and how we define all these things are not just in the context of a hospital or a home health nurse visiting a patient at home. It's our human health. It's huge. Yeah, and everywhere you look, that's what's being called for right now.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head too, Tomas, with when you said, part of human health, right, is we're not just here to be economic units, right, but the contributing to something bigger than ourselves, I think is again probably an unmeasured contribution to our well-being, both as individuals and in our communities. This certainly absolutely applies to the field of healthcare, but quite frankly, I've always felt like we spend more of our waking time at these places we call work, jobs, so why wouldn't we be, yes, making our lives more richer, developing ourselves and each other, and really nurturing this space of contributing together to something larger than ourselves. And I feel like MettaCare is an incredible catalyzer for that.
I would like to say something about kind of the vision that I've had in the conversations with Kabir, is that I always think, as we have commented, recognizing that maybe we're benefiting in this moment from some good health, or we are able to get up and take more care of ourselves. And yet when I really dive into the word care, I think about all the ways that I'm missing care in my life. And I have this vision of MettaCare as these nodes of community that are small, perhaps, maybe oriented around one house, or maybe more expanded than that, but where I can actually belong to something that would ultimately, with this omnidirectional idea, support my own care and really be reflecting into that as, as a community of people. And so I see it really as an opportunity of, this might be a little off in the analogy, but I always think about the 12-step process of AA and the various elements of that. It's an inside job that starts here, that, and the elements of believing that you're part of something larger than yourself, believing that you're worthy of well-being. And so when I look at the 12 steps and I say, well, I know this was sort of initiated from the point of view of someone who struggled with alcohol, but it's really relevant to all of us. And so I think that's the vision I have seen in my conversations with Kabir about it being, yes, relevant for someone in need of specific care, but to really delve into the word of care and consider how a different way of organizing that can benefit everybody.
Yeah, at least I would just speak briefly to that, just about my experience of the recent crowdfund initiative and the success that we've had there. That people in the last few months have, occasionally asked me, how are you doing? And my care is thin, like staffing unavailable, money to pay them uncertain, my health faltering at times as a result of the stress, my sleep failing, my ability even to get up and work on MettaCare, in a way that makes it somehow accessible, limited. And yet at the same time, the fact that 47 people came forward and more in the crowdfund and gave a little bit or a lot, and the people that have been around me, like you, that have come to be here in the house with me, or Tomas or Katie, who just spend some time on the phone just expressing their care and their joy in our friendship. That these elements have made it impossible for me to say, not well, you know, although my body is weak and stiff, and I maybe didn't eat as much as I ought to have, or less hydrated, or on antibiotics again. But like, you can't say not well, because what's present is so much outweighs in my lived experience. And it translates to my well-being, so that I'm like staring down the barrel of this doesn't work. I'm really at my wit's end, and I don't see a road. And yet, in spite of that, I have to be unreasonably happy about this moment, because there is a really important wellness present.
So maybe in closing, I'd like to just re-emphasize that, I mean, part of my stepping forward, of course, is my deep love for you, Kabir, and knowing that you're at your financial wits end. And, you know, I know that your health has been faltering because of the stressors, as you said, around that. And in face of the challenges that most of us don't have to deal with like you do every day, what always blows me away is right now, as you've just embodied, you always end in gratitude. And this capacity to say, how can I say not well, you know, in the face of the stressors that you face, is really the kernel of what MettaCare is born from. And I encourage anybody who might be watching this, if you're not subscribed to Kabir's blog, he daily writes, and you really get an insider's view of what I just shared, you know, both the challenges and I do read it almost every day, and it reminds me to go to sleep every night with gratitude in my heart, in my being, you know, to rest back into being, that no matter what no matter how frustrating the day has been or whatever I have been up against, you know, so it's a real joy to be here with you, and to also just get a deeper sense of what MettaCare is, and its potential, its importance, its urgency in this time.
What a reflection. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's done.